So the question was originally about how do we make the system work for people with psychosocial disability, and I think the NDIS is a very big part of that now. It's probably the single biggest recurrent funding stream available for this particular group of people, although having said that, there is some other service funding available in different jurisdictions. So I'll probably make about 8 or 9 points. The first one is the NDIS is not really designed around cohorts of people. It kind of treats, except unless you're a child, it really treats people with autism and people with physical disability and people with psychosocial disability all pretty much the same. So it's really looking at you as a result of your disability. It's not really looking at you around the drivers of your disability. And there's sort of 2 main types of services you may need from that. One is the services you need to compensate you for the things you can't do so that you can participate. So if you have a disability that stops you being able to shower yourself and properly feed yourself, you need services to compensate so that you can participate. But the other set of services are much more around building your capability, building your capacity, building your independence and your agency, which is somewhere in there is what we would call the recovery-based services. But then the way you do that is going to be different if you have an adult with severe autism as compared with an adult with a psychosocial disability and tending to have ongoing periods of being psychiatrically unwell. So the system isn't very well designed for the type of service you need and the sort of person you are. It's also moved from a service model to a business model. So the organisations that grew up over the, I'm not sure it was 70 years, and you don't look that old, it's pretty impressive. But over a long period, organisations like Flourish and Nemi and Mind and others to work with this particular cohort in particular in the early days are now one of many organisations in a market rather than a service sector. And that market's grown from having a few hundred providers to having thousands of providers. And you can be a provider and know nothing about mental illness or recovery, nothing. Now, we don't let people provide publicly funded aromatherapy to treat cancer. If you have cancer and you want aromatherapy and you choose to pay for it, you can do it, but not under any illusions it's going to cure your cancer. It just might make you feel better. But in this instance, we are acting as if people with disabilities, and in this case, psychosocial disability, every service they receive will be equal. And that tells me there's no urgency about recovery. It's just about having a market response. And in some cases, people are paying home care rates. I was talking to someone earlier, home care rates, not even SHADS rates, because that's the way to make money out of this. The third thing is there really isn't a system. We do talk about a system, but there really isn't a system because there's a pretty big, and we've heard this from people throughout the day, there's quite a big separation between your illness and your life. And you can get treatment for symptoms and be in an acute phase, and there's no guarantee you'll get any recovery service if you're not eligible for those, or there is a waiting list, or there's no automatic system to refer you to those. There are lots of episodes of disconnected service. And we did build more integrated models of care, and somehow in the transition to a consumer-driven choice and control model, which has many, many good aspects to it, we lost the notion of integrated care and support. We lost the notion that getting some service over here and some service over there. It would be ideal if they were connected in some way to help build that notion of recovery. And part of the problem with that, and Jerry touched on this earlier, is we don't have much expectation of evidence. So just like we don't have an expectation that in providing supports you have to know much about the things driving your clients' disability, we also don't expect you to know much about what works. Could be aromatherapy, who knows? And again, there's nothing wrong with things that make you feel better, but we shouldn't be under illusions that they're going to change things necessarily for you. So we don't have an emphasis on evidence. We don't have standards, things like that. And that relates to this notion of we now have a market, we don't have a service sector. And so that whole notion of how we help people have informed choice, I think, is absolutely critical. There is, in mental health, unlike a lot of other forms of healthcare, there is this odd demarcation between what is the state's role and what is the Commonwealth's role, and what is the role of the disability department versus the health department versus the housing department. Now, again, those things exist in other forms of service to a greater or lesser degree. But if you are having treatment, if you're having treatment for some of the health conditions like cancer, you can guarantee that throughout that provision, you are getting a combination of Commonwealth and state dollars, but it isn't obvious to you and it isn't necessary for it to be obvious to you. And frankly, you don't care. You just want to get a good set of services and you want to feel confident about them. But we know in mental health, much more than in other forms of healthcare, about what the state will do and won't do, what the Commonwealth's job is and isn't, whether the NDIS sees it as a disability issue or a mental health issue. So we get these odd experiences where if you're providing supported housing to people with psychosocial disability, a lot of those packages are being reviewed and now being provided not as SIL but as core, if people understand some of that lingo. And that's because there's a view that you don't really need 24-hour support when you have a psychosocial disability, because you don't necessarily need help going to the toilet, you don't necessarily need help being peg-fed, you don't necessarily need certain other forms of medication. The fact that you have problems sleeping and tend to pace the house overnight, become more and more anxious, that triggers other behaviours, the result of that might be that the service you get is from the police. How is that fair? How is that fair when the driver of your disability is related to all of these other things going on? So I really agree with the point earlier about we're kind of pre-adolescent in understanding how to tailor these services and supports for this particular cohort. And then there's this notion of measuring progress. How do we measure progress? And we've heard from people today about losing packages of support, but not everyone wants the same intensity of support all the time. And this goes to the issue of how do you have a sense of I'm making progress I can do with a bit less support or a different type of support at this moment in time. But I also know that I'm living with some issues that may reemerge and I might need some intensity and I might need it quickly. And the final point I want to make, because it's come up a few times today and I think it's worth keeping in mind, is this notion of the power relationships that operate in mental health provision. And this is a long-standing issue, but as someone who ran child protection services in Victoria for a long time, wherever the state has coercive powers, it changes the relationship. And many of those coercive powers exist, as we know, between clinicians and clients in mental health, but they also operate between organisations, operate between NGOs and health services, between governments, and to some extent they now operate in the provision of NDIS services, because this group are a small cohort compared to the overall cohort. They have, in my view, much, much less voice than people with other forms of disabilities in the scheme. And things are easier to change without a whole lot of pushback or complaint. And the fact that you can be waiting to find out if you're eligible for 6 or 9 or 12 months, what are you most likely to do? People with other forms of disability who often have more advocates around them, place more pressure. People with access to lawyers and place more pressure. People with psychosocial disabilities disappear and give up. So those power relationships are still alive and well, and it's better that we name them and understand them than let them go.